Margaret Williams sat in her small apartment, staring at the invitation in her hands. The thick, cream-colored paper felt heavy between her fingers. Naval Academy graduation ceremony. It read in elegant gold lettering. Below that, her son's name, Midshipman Thomas Williams. She had waited 22 years for this moment. The morning sun streamed through her kitchen window as she read the invitation for the 100th time. Thomas had worked so hard to get to this point. After his father died when Thomas was only 8 years old, Margaret had to raise him alone. Money was always tight. She worked double shifts at the diner just to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. Margaret remembered how Thomas used to come home from school with bruised knuckles and torn clothes. The other kids would tease him about his worn-out shoes and hand-me-down clothes. But he never complained. Instead, he would sit at their small kitchen table every night, doing his homework by the light of a single lamp. He dreamed of something bigger than their small town could offer. When Thomas told her he wanted to join the Navy, Margaret felt scared. She had already lost her husband to military service. The thought of losing her son, too, made her stomach turn. But she saw the fire in Thomas's eyes when he talked about serving his country. She knew she couldn't stand in the way of his dreams. Getting into the Naval Academy wasn't easy. Thomas needed perfect grades, letters of recommendation, and had to pass difficult physical and mental tests. Margaret watched him train every morning before school, running miles through their neighborhood while most people were still sleeping. He would come home exhausted, but never gave up. The night before Thomas left for the academy, Margaret sat on his bed watching him pack. His room looked so empty with all his belongings stuffed into 2 duffel bags. "Mom, I'm going to make you proud," he had promised her. "When I graduate, I'll be an officer. We'll never have to worry about money again." Margaret smiled at the memory as she folded the invitation carefully. She had saved every penny from her tips for the past 4 years, hoping to afford the trip to Maryland for his graduation. The train ticket alone cost more than she made in a week. But nothing would keep her away from seeing her son receive his commission. She walked to her bedroom and opened her closet. Most of her clothes were old and worn from years of washing. She pulled out the one good dress she owned, a simple black dress she had bought for her husband's funeral. It would have to do. As she held it up to herself in the mirror, she caught sight of the tattoo on her shoulder. The tattoo was small but meaningful. It showed an anchor with a rope wrapped around it, and underneath, the dates 2001 to 2003 in simple numbers. Most people who saw it assumed it was just a sailor's tattoo. They had no idea what it really meant or why Margaret kept it hidden under her clothes. Margaret had gotten the tattoo during the darkest period of her life. After her husband died, she felt lost and alone. Thomas was struggling in school, and she was working 3 jobs just to survive. During that time, she made choices she wasn't proud of. Choices that helped her family survive, but came at a personal cost. The tattoo reminded her of a promise she made to herself, to never let anyone see her as weak again. She had never told Thomas about that time in her life. As far as he knew, she had always been just a waitress at the local diner. Some secrets were better left buried. Margaret folded the dress carefully and placed it back in the closet. She would find a way to keep the tattoo covered during the graduation ceremony. The weeks leading up to graduation passed slowly. Margaret picked up extra shifts at the diner to make sure she had enough money for the trip. Her feet ached from standing for 12 hours a day, but she didn't mind. Every sore muscle was worth it for Thomas. Her co-workers at the diner knew how excited she was. "Your boy's going to be a Navy officer," said Betty, the other waitress who had worked there for 30 years. "You must be so proud." Margaret nodded, but inside she felt nervous. The Naval Academy was a world she didn't understand, full of important people and traditions she knew nothing about. Margaret had never been to a military ceremony before. She worried about saying the wrong thing or not knowing how to act. Thomas had tried to prepare her during their phone calls. He explained about the uniforms, the saluting, and the formal speeches. But it all seemed overwhelming. 3 days before the ceremony, Margaret received a phone call from Thomas. His voice sounded excited but nervous. "Mom, I have some news. Admiral Richardson is going to be giving the main speech at graduation. He's one of the most decorated officers in the Navy. This is a huge honor." Margaret had never heard of Admiral Richardson, but she could tell from Thomas's voice that this was important. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," she said. "I can't wait to see you graduate." "Mom, I've been thinking," Thomas said, his voice getting quieter. "Maybe you should sit in the back during the ceremony. Some of my classmates have parents who are senators and business executives. I just don't want you to feel out of place." Margaret felt a sharp pain in her chest. After all these years of sacrifice, Her son was ashamed of her. "Of course," she managed to say. "Whatever makes you comfortable." After she hung up the phone, Margaret sat in her kitchen and cried. She understood why Thomas felt that way, but it still hurt. She looked at herself in the hallway mirror. Her hands were rough from years of hard work. Her clothes were old and simple. Compared to the other parents who would be there, she probably would look out of place. But Margaret had made up her mind. She was going to be there for her son's graduation, no matter what. She had sacrificed too much and come too far to back down now. Thomas might be embarrassed by her, but she was proud of him. That's what mattered. The night before leaving for Maryland, Margaret packed her small suitcase. She included the black dress and a cardigan to make sure her tattoos stayed covered. She also packed the only photograph she had of Thomas's father in his military uniform. Even though he couldn't be there, she wanted to carry a piece of him with her. Margaret barely slept that night. She kept thinking about all the things that could go wrong. What if she embarrassed Thomas? What if people could tell she didn't belong there? What if someone discovered her secret? She tried to push these thoughts away, but they kept coming back. The train ride to Maryland took 8 hours. Margaret had never traveled so far from home before. She watched the countryside pass by her window, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a young widow struggling to survive to the proud mother of a Naval Academy graduate. It had been a long and difficult road. As the train pulled into the station near the Naval Academy, Margaret felt her heart racing. She could see the Academy's buildings in the distance, tall, impressive structures that looked like something from a movie. This was really happening. Her son was about to become a Navy officer. Margaret took a deep breath and gathered her belongings. She had come this far, and nothing was going to stop her now. Tomorrow, she would watch Thomas graduate, and, for the first time in years, she would allow herself to feel proud. The tattoo on her shoulder might hold painful memories, but it also reminded her of her strength. She had survived the worst life could throw at her, and she had raised an incredible son. As she stepped off the train, Margaret felt a mixture of fear and excitement. She had no idea that in less than 24 hours, her carefully guarded secret would be exposed in front of hundreds of people, including one of the most powerful men in the Navy. She had no idea that Admiral Richardson would recognize her tattoo immediately and understand exactly what it meant. Most importantly, she had no idea that her past, which she had worked so hard to hide, was about to change both her life and her son's future forever. The small hotel room Margaret had booked was simple but clean. She hung up her black dress carefully and tried to get some sleep. Tomorrow would be the most important day of her life, and she wanted to be ready for whatever came next. The morning of graduation arrived with perfect spring weather. Margaret woke up early in her hotel room, feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness that made her stomach flutter. She had barely slept, spending most of the night staring at the ceiling and thinking about the day ahead. Margaret took extra time getting ready. She wanted to look her best for Thomas, even if he had asked her to sit in the back. She put on her black dress and carefully arranged her cardigan to make sure it covered her tattoo completely. Looking in the mirror, she practiced smiling and tried to imagine herself blending in with the other parents. The Naval Academy campus was already bustling with activity when Margaret arrived. Families were everywhere, well-dressed people walking confidently across the grounds. Margaret felt immediately out of place. The other mothers wore expensive dresses and jewelry that probably cost more than Margaret made in a year. The fathers looked like they belonged in boardrooms or country clubs. Margaret found the graduation venue and looked for a seat in the back, as Thomas had suggested. The ceremony was being held in a large outdoor area with hundreds of white chairs arranged in perfect rows. A stage was set up at the front with flags and naval banners creating an impressive backdrop. As Margaret settled into her seat, she couldn't help but notice the conversations around her. Parents were talking about their vacation homes, their children's post-graduation plans to serve on prestigious ships, and connections they had in Washington. Margaret felt more isolated with every word. "Our Jennifer is going to be stationed in San Diego," she heard one woman say. "Her father's old college roommate is a congressman there. He's already promised to keep an eye on her." Margaret thought about Thomas, who had no connections or advantages beyond his own hard work and determination. She felt proud of him for getting this far on his own, but also worried about his future. In this world of privilege and connections, would merit alone be enough? The ceremony began with the arrival of distinguished guests. Margaret watched as admirals, generals, and government officials took their seats on the stage. Their uniforms were covered with ribbons and medals that spoke of years of service and honor. Then, she saw him, Admiral Richardson. Admiral Richardson was an impressive man in his early 60s. His uniform was immaculate, and his bearing commanded instant respect. Margaret could see why Thomas had been so excited about him speaking at the graduation. Everything about the Admiral radiated authority and experience. The ceremony proceeded with military precision. The graduating midshipmen marched onto the field in perfect formation, their white uniforms gleaming in the morning sun. Margaret scanned the rows of young faces until she spotted Thomas. He looked so handsome and proud in his uniform. All those years of struggle and sacrifice had led to this moment. Admiral Richardson's speech was powerful and inspiring. He talked about duty, honor, and the responsibilities that came with being a naval officer. Margaret found herself hanging on every word, even though she didn't understand all the military references. She could see Thomas and his classmates listening intently, their faces showing the seriousness of the commitment they were making. Today, you join a brotherhood and sisterhood that spans centuries, Admiral Richardson said, his voice carrying clearly across the audience. You will face challenges that will test not just your training, but your character. The decisions you make will affect not just yourselves, but the sailors who will follow your lead. As the speech continued, Margaret felt the warm morning sun beating down on her. The cardigan she wore to hide her tattoo was making her uncomfortably hot. She tried to ignore the discomfort, not wanting to draw attention to herself by removing it. The heat continued to build as the ceremony progressed. Other people around her were fanning themselves with their programs, but Margaret was trapped by her need to keep her tattoo hidden. Sweat began to form on her forehead, and she felt dizzy from the combination of heat and nervousness. When it came time for the oath-taking, all the graduates stood together and raised their right hands. Margaret felt tears in her eyes as she listened to her son promise to defend the Constitution and faithfully discharge his duties as an officer. This was the moment she had dreamed of for 4 years. After the oath, it was time for the graduates to receive their commissions. They were called up in alphabetical order, which meant Margaret had to wait anxiously for Thomas's name to be called. When Midshipman Thomas Williams was finally announced, Margaret felt her heart swell with pride. Thomas walked across the stage with perfect military bearing. Admiral Richardson himself shook his hand and presented him with his commission. For a brief moment, Thomas looked out into the audience, and Margaret was sure his eyes found hers. She waved slightly, not caring any more about sitting in the back or trying to be invisible. The heat was becoming unbearable. Margaret's cardigan felt like it was suffocating her, and she began to feel lightheaded. She tried to focus on the ceremony, but the combination of emotion, heat, and exhaustion was overwhelming her body. She hadn't eaten much in the past few days due to nervousness, and now it was catching up with her. As the ceremony continued with more speeches and presentations, Margaret felt herself becoming increasingly unsteady. The chairs around her seemed to be spinning slightly, and she had to grip the sides of her seat to stay upright. She didn't want to cause a scene, especially not at Thomas's graduation, but her body was betraying her. The final part of the ceremony was the traditional hat toss. All the new officers threw their midshipman covers into the air in celebration while the crowd cheered. Margaret tried to stand and applaud with everyone else, but as she rose from her chair, the world suddenly tilted sideways. Margaret felt herself falling but couldn't do anything to stop it. The last thing she remembered was the sound of people gasping and chairs scraping as she collapsed onto the ground. The carefully arranged cardigan that had hidden her secret for the entire ceremony fell away from her shoulder as concerned strangers rushed to help her. When Margaret regained consciousness, she was lying on a bench in the shade behind the ceremony area. Several people were standing around her, including a Navy medic who was checking her pulse. Her cardigan was gone, and she could feel the cool air on her exposed shoulder and upper arm. "Ma'am, you had a heat stroke," the medic was saying. "You're going to be okay, but you need to stay hydrated and cool." Margaret tried to sit up, but gentle hands held her down. "Just rest for a moment," someone said kindly. As Margaret's vision cleared, she realized with horror that her tattoo was completely visible. The small anchor with its wrapped rope and the dates 2001 to 2003 were there for everyone to see. She tried to cover it with her hand, but it was too late. Several people had already noticed it, and she could see them whispering to each other. That's when she heard a familiar voice that made her blood run cold. "Everyone please step back and give her some space." It was Admiral Richardson. He had left the ceremony to check on her personally. As he knelt down beside the bench, his eyes immediately went to her tattoo. Margaret watched as the Admiral's expression changed from polite concern to something much more complex. His eyes widened slightly, and she saw his jaw tighten. He stared at the tattoo for a long moment, and Margaret knew without a doubt that he recognized it. He knew exactly what those numbers meant and what they represented. "I know that marking," Admiral Richardson said quietly, his voice so low that only Margaret could hear him. His eyes met hers, and she saw a mixture of surprise, understanding, and something else she couldn't identify. "We need to talk." Margaret felt panic rising in her chest. This was her worst nightmare coming true. After all these years of keeping her secret buried, it was about to be exposed at the most important moment of her son's life. She could only imagine what Thomas would think when he found out the truth about his mother's past. "Please," she whispered to the Admiral, "don't let this ruin his day. He doesn't know. He can't know." Admiral Richardson studied her face for a long moment. Around them, the ceremony was winding down, and families were beginning to reunite with their newly commissioned officers. Soon, Thomas would be looking for his mother, expecting to find her celebrating his achievement. "Mrs. Williams," the Admiral said, having clearly recognized her last name from the graduation program. "There are things we need to discuss. But not here, not now. This is your son's day." He helped her sit up slowly. "Can you walk? We need to get you back to the ceremony before he comes looking for you." Margaret nodded, though she felt weak and shaky. The medic handed her a bottle of water and insisted she drink it slowly. Someone found her cardigan and handed it to her. With trembling fingers, she put it back on, once again hiding the tattoo that had just changed everything. As they walked slowly back toward the ceremony area, Admiral Richardson stayed close beside her. "I want you to enjoy the rest of today," he said quietly. "Celebrate with your son. He's accomplished something remarkable, and you should be proud. But tomorrow morning, I want to see you in my office. We have a lot to discuss about those numbers on your arm." Margaret could only nod. She felt like she was walking in a dream, everything surreal and frightening. When they reached the edge of the ceremony area, she could see Thomas looking around frantically, clearly searching for her. His face lit up with relief when he spotted her. "Mom, there you are." Thomas ran over and wrapped her in a huge hug. "I was worried when I couldn't find you after the hat toss. Are you okay? Someone said there was a medical emergency back here." "I'm fine, sweetheart," Margaret managed to say, forcing a smile. "Just got a little overheated." "I'm so proud of you, Thomas. So incredibly proud." As mother and son embraced, Admiral Richardson watched from a distance. His expression was unreadable, but Margaret could feel his eyes on her. Tomorrow would bring questions she wasn't prepared to answer and revelations that could change everything. But, for now, she held her son tight and tried to focus on his moment of triumph, knowing it might be the last time he looked at her with such uncomplicated pride and love. That evening, Margaret sat across from Thomas at a small restaurant near the Naval Academy. He looked so different in his civilian clothes, but the pride in his eyes remained constant. They had spent the afternoon taking pictures and meeting his classmates and their families. Margaret had smiled and made polite conversation, all while feeling Admiral Richardson's words echoing in her mind. "Mom, you seem distracted," Thomas said, reaching across the table to touch her hand. "Are you sure you're feeling okay after what happened earlier?" Margaret forced herself to focus on her son. This might be one of their last peaceful moments together, and she wanted to treasure it. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just overwhelmed by how proud I am of you. Tell me about your assignment. Where will you be stationed?" Thomas's face lit up. "I've been assigned to the USS Constitution in Norfolk, Virginia. It's not the most glamorous assignment, but it's a good ship with a solid crew. The commanding officer has a reputation for being tough, but fair. I think I can learn a lot there." Margaret nodded, though her knowledge of Navy ships was limited. "When do you report for duty?" "I have 2 weeks of leave first. Then, I report to Norfolk. I was thinking maybe we could spend some time together back home. I know you need to get back to work, but maybe we could have a few days." The guilt hit Margaret like a physical blow. Here was her son, wanting to spend time with her before starting his naval career, and she was sitting across from him harboring secrets that could destroy everything between them. "Of course," she said. "I'd love that." They talked about his plans, his hopes for his naval career, and memories from his childhood. Margaret tried to memorize every word, every expression. If tomorrow's meeting with Admiral Richardson went as badly as she feared, this might be the last time Thomas looked at her with such love and respect. After dinner, they walked back to Margaret's hotel. The academy grounds were quiet now, with most of the graduation festivities over. Thomas walked her to the lobby, giving her another long hug before saying goodbye. "I'll pick you up tomorrow morning for breakfast before you head back home," he said. "I want to spend every minute I can with you while you're here." Margaret's heart broke a little more. "That sounds wonderful," she managed to say. Back in her hotel room, Margaret sat on the edge of the bed staring at her reflection in the mirror. Slowly, she removed her cardigan and looked at the tattoo that had changed everything. The small anchor seemed to mock her now, a reminder of choices she had made long ago that were about to catch up with her. She had gotten the tattoo in 2003, at the end of a period in her life she had tried desperately to forget. After her husband's death, Margaret had found herself alone with an 8-year-old son and crushing debt. The life insurance had barely covered the funeral expenses, and she was working multiple jobs just to keep their heads above water. That's when she met Jake Morrison. Jake was a recruiter for a private security company that operated in some of the world's most dangerous places. He offered her a job that would pay more in 6 months than she could make in 3 years at the diner. The catch was that it required her to leave Thomas with her sister and travel to places where American military contractors needed support services. Margaret had never intended to become involved in anything questionable. The job description had been vague, but legitimate sounding. She would be providing administrative and logistical support to American personnel overseas. What Jake hadn't told her was that the support often involved activities that existed in the gray areas between legal and illegal. For 2 years, Margaret had worked for Jake's company in various locations throughout the Middle East and Eastern Europe. She had helped facilitate transactions that she suspected were not entirely above board. She had handled communications between people who she gradually realized were selling information and equipment to whoever paid the highest price. By the time she understood what she was really involved in, she was in too deep to walk away safely. The tattoo marked the end of that period in her life. In 2003, Jake's operation had been exposed by military intelligence. Several people in the organization had been arrested, and Margaret had barely escaped prosecution herself. She had testified against Jake and his associates in exchange for immunity, but the experience left her traumatized and paranoid. Margaret had returned home to Thomas with enough money to start over, but also with knowledge that could be dangerous to the wrong people. She had taken every precaution to bury her past, changing her appearance, moving to a different town, and creating a simple life that would draw no attention. The tattoo was a reminder to herself of how close she had come to losing everything, including her son. Now, 22 years later, that past had collided with her present in the worst possible way. Admiral Richardson clearly knew what the numbers on her tattoo meant. Military intelligence had long memories, and someone in his position would have access to files that ordinary people never saw. Margaret barely slept that night. She kept imagining different scenarios for the next day's meeting. Best case, Admiral Richardson would ask a few questions and then let sleeping dogs lie. Worst case, he would reopen the investigation into Jake's organization and Margaret would find herself facing charges that had been dormant for over 2 decades. But what terrified her most was the thought of Thomas finding out. How could she explain to him that the money that had helped put him through school, the stability that had allowed him to focus on his dreams, had come from activities that were morally and possibly legally questionable? How could she tell him that his mother was not the simple, hard-working waitress he believed her to be? Morning came too soon. Margaret dressed carefully in her simple clothes, knowing that in a few hours she would be facing one of the most powerful men in the Navy. She met Thomas for breakfast as planned, forcing herself to act normal while her stomach churned with anxiety. "You're not eating much," Thomas observed as Margaret pushed her eggs around her plate. "I'm just sad about leaving," she said, which was partially true. "I'm going to miss you so much." After breakfast, Thomas walked her to the train station. Admiral Richardson had arranged to meet her before her departure, and Margaret had told Thomas she wanted to tour the academy grounds one more time before leaving. It wasn't entirely a lie. "Mom," Thomas said as they stood on the platform, "I want you to know how grateful I am for everything you've done for me. I know it wasn't easy raising me alone, working all those jobs to support us. Everything I've accomplished is because of your sacrifice." Margaret felt tears threatening to spill over. "You did this yourself, Thomas. I just tried not to get in your way." "You did so much more than that," he insisted. "You gave me stability, values, and the belief that I could be anything I wanted to be. Whatever happens in my career, I want you to know that you'll always be my hero." After Thomas left to report for his leave processing, Margaret made her way to the building where Admiral Richardson's temporary office was located. The secretary showed her into a small conference room and offered her coffee, which she declined. Her hands were already shaking enough without caffeine. When Admiral Richardson entered the room, he looked every bit as imposing as he had during the ceremony. He was carrying a thick file folder, which he set on the table before taking a seat across from her. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. "Mrs. Williams," he began, his voice formal but not unkind. "I want you to know that this conversation is unofficial. I'm here because I recognized your tattoo and felt obligated to follow up. What we discuss today will determine how this matter proceeds." Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. "The numbers on your tattoo correspond to dates when you were employed by Morrison Security Solutions," the Admiral continued, consulting the file. "That organization was investigated by military intelligence for activities that included arms trafficking, information brokering, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. You testified against Jacob Morrison and several of his associates in 2003. "Yes," Margaret whispered. "According to the files, you received immunity in exchange for your cooperation. The investigation was classified, and your identity was protected. As far as official records show, Margaret Williams died in a car accident in 2003, and you became Margaret Williams of Cedar Creek, Pennsylvania. You've lived a quiet life since then, working at a diner and raising your son." Margaret stared at him in shock. She had never realized how thoroughly her new identity had been constructed or how much the government knew about her life. Admiral Richardson leaned forward slightly. "What I need to understand, Mrs. Williams, is why you chose that tattoo. Most people who want to forget a traumatic experience don't permanently mark it on their body." Margaret took a shaky breath. "I never wanted to forget how close I came to losing my soul," she said quietly. "I wanted to remember what desperation could make me do, so I would never let myself get that desperate again. The tattoo was my promise to myself that I would never again put my son at risk for money, no matter how difficult things got." The Admiral studied her for a long moment. "And have you kept that promise?" "Every day for 22 years, Margaret said firmly. "I've worked honest jobs, paid my taxes, and raised my son to be a man of integrity. I've never had any contact with anyone from that life. I've never used any information I gained during those years. I've lived as clean a life as I know how." Admiral Richardson nodded slowly. "I believe you," he said. "But, Mrs. Williams, there's something you need to know about your son's assignment." Admiral Richardson opened the file folder and pulled out several documents. Margaret could see official Navy letterhead and what appeared to be assignment orders. Her stomach dropped as she realized that Thomas's future was somehow connected to her past. "The USS Constitution isn't just any ship, Mrs. Williams," the Admiral began. "It's currently part of a joint task force investigating maritime security threats in the Mediterranean. Specifically, they're tracking remnants of organizations that were involved in arms trafficking during the early 2000s. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. "You mean, some of Jake Morrison's network is still active," Admiral Richardson confirmed. "Not Morrison himself. He died in federal prison 5 years ago. But several of his associates were never caught, and they've continued operating under different names and through different channels. Intelligence suggests they're now working with terrorist organizations to move weapons through European ports." The room seemed to spin around Margaret. After all these years of believing that chapter of her life was closed, it was still ongoing. "What does this have to do with Thomas?" Admiral Richardson's expression became even more serious. "Your son's assignment to the Constitution wasn't random, Mrs. Williams. When his background investigation was conducted for his security clearance, certain flags were raised. Not because of anything he did wrong, but because of connections to his mother's past that appeared in classified databases." "Are you saying Thomas knows about my history?" Margaret asked, panic rising in her voice. "No," the Admiral said quickly. "The investigators concluded that he had no knowledge of your previous activities. His clearance was approved based on his own character and conduct. But, Mrs. Williams, there are people in positions of power who believe your knowledge of Morrison's organization could be valuable to current operations." Margaret shook her head emphatically. "I don't remember anything useful. It's been over 20 years. The people I knew, the places we operated, the methods we used, everything would have changed by now." "You might be surprised what details prove valuable," Admiral Richardson said. "Organizational structures, personal relationships, financial mechanisms, some of these things evolve rather than disappear completely. The intelligence community has been looking for any way to penetrate these networks, and you represent a unique resource." "I won't do it," Margaret said firmly. I left that life behind. I won't be dragged back into it. And I certainly won't let my son be used as leverage against me. Admiral Richardson leaned back in his chair. Mrs. Williams, I want to be very clear about something. This meeting is happening because I chose to make it happen. I could have allowed this situation to develop without your knowledge or input. The fact that I'm sitting here talking to you face to face is because I believe you deserve to understand what's at stake. What do you mean? There are people who would prefer to approach this differently. They would place your son in situations where his safety depends on your cooperation. They would use him as an unwitting asset, putting him at risk without his knowledge. I'm offering you a different path. Margaret felt sick. You're threatening my son. No, Mrs. Williams. I'm trying to protect him. The Admiral's voice became gentler. I've read his file. He's an exceptional young man with a bright future ahead of him. I don't want to see that future compromised because of decisions made before he was born. Then, what are you proposing? Admiral Richardson pulled out another set of documents. I'm proposing that you work with us voluntarily, not as a covert operative or undercover agent, but as a consultant. You would help our intelligence analysts understand the organizational culture and operational methods of Morrison's network. You would review intelligence reports and provide context that might help us identify current activities. And in exchange, your son gets transferred to a safe assignment, far away from any operations involving these networks. He continues his naval career without ever knowing why his assignment changed. You provide consultation on a limited basis, and when the current operation concludes, everyone goes back to their normal lives. Margaret stared at the documents without reading them. What happens if I refuse? I can't guarantee your son's safety, Admiral Richardson said bluntly. There are people who will use any leverage available to accomplish their missions. If you refuse to cooperate voluntarily, they may decide to create circumstances that force your hand. Thomas could find himself in dangerous situations where his survival depends on intelligence that only you can provide. The weight of the situation settled on Margaret like a heavy blanket. She thought about Thomas, so proud and eager to begin his naval career. He had worked so hard to get where he was, and now his future was being threatened by choices his mother had made decades before he was born. How long would this consultation period last? Margaret asked. 6 months. Possibly less if we're successful in disrupting their current operations. You would remain in your current life, working at the diner, maintaining your normal routine. Periodically, you would receive phone calls or visits from intelligence analysts who need your perspective on specific questions. And Thomas would never know? Thomas would never know, Admiral Richardson confirmed. As far as he's concerned, his assignment change would be a routine adjustment based on Navy needs. Many junior officers have their initial assignments modified. Margaret thought about the tattoo on her shoulder, the promise she had made to herself never to compromise her integrity again for any amount of money. But this wasn't about money. This was about protecting her son from consequences of choices he hadn't made. I need to know more about what you're asking me to do, Margaret said finally. I won't do anything that puts innocent people at risk. Admiral Richardson nodded. I expected no less from you. The operation is focused specifically on disrupting weapons trafficking networks. We're not asking you to participate in any activities that would endanger civilians or compromise legitimate operations. You would simply be providing historical context and cultural insight. What kind of questions would you be asking? The Admiral pulled out a sample document. Things like organizational hierarchy, how decisions were made, how disputes were resolved, what kinds of people Morrison recruited, and how he motivated them. Details about how financial transactions were conducted, how communications were secured, what kinds of backup plans were typically in place. Margaret scanned the questions. They seemed reasonable enough, focused on general patterns rather than specific operations or individuals. Would I be required to testify in court again? Not unless you chose to. This is intelligence gathering, not criminal prosecution. The goal is to understand these networks well enough to disrupt their current operations, not necessarily to build court cases. And you guarantee my son's safety? I guarantee that he will be assigned to duties that keep him far away from any operations involving these networks. He'll be able to serve his country honorably without ever being exposed to the dangers associated with your past. Margaret realized she was trapped. If she refused, Thomas could end up in danger through no fault of his own. If she agreed, she would be breaking the promise she had made to herself to never again become involved in morally ambiguous activities. But protecting her son had to take priority over her own peace of mind. I want to see the assignment orders, Margaret said. I want to know exactly where Thomas is being sent and what his duties will be. Admiral Richardson handed her another document. Margaret read through it carefully. According to the orders, Thomas would be transferred to a training facility in San Diego, where he would be working on naval education programs. It was about as safe an assignment as a young officer could hope for. This seems almost too good to be true, Margaret said suspiciously. Training facilities don't usually need junior officers fresh out of the academy. There's a new program being developed to improve training methods for naval personnel, Admiral Richardson explained. Your son's academic record and leadership potential make him a good candidate to help develop and implement these improvements. It's legitimate work that will actually benefit his career development. Margaret looked at her son's name on the transfer orders. Even his new assignment was being arranged to protect him from her past. The irony was overwhelming. The same government that had once investigated her was now going out of its way to ensure her son's safety. If I agree to this, I want regular updates on Thomas's situation, Margaret said. I want to know that he's safe and that his career isn't being damaged by any of this. That can be arranged, Admiral Richardson said. You'll have a designated contact person who can provide those updates. Margaret thought about Thomas, probably back at the academy right now, excited about his upcoming assignment, and completely unaware that his mother was negotiating his future. She thought about the tattoo on her shoulder and the promise it represented. Sometimes keeping one promise required breaking another. I'll do it, Margaret said quietly. I'll provide whatever consultation you need. But I want it clearly understood that I won't participate in anything illegal or anything that puts innocent people at risk. Admiral Richardson extended his hand across the table. You have my word, Mrs. Williams. This operation is about protecting innocent people, not endangering them. As Margaret shook his hand, she wondered if she was making the right choice. But, looking at Thomas's transfer orders, she knew she couldn't live with herself if something happened to him because she was too proud to help prevent it. When do we start? She asked. Someone will contact you within the week, Admiral Richardson said. For now, go home and enjoy your time with your son. Let him believe that his assignment change is just good luck. He's earned the right to be happy about his future. Margaret gathered her belongings and stood to leave. As she reached the door, Admiral Richardson called her name. Mrs. Williams, for what it's worth, I think you made the right choices 20 years ago. Testifying against Morrison's organization took courage, and raising your son to be the man he is today took even more courage. Don't let anyone make you feel ashamed of your past. Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She left the building and walked slowly back toward the train station, knowing that her life had just changed in ways she was only beginning to understand. 3 months later, Margaret stood in the kitchen of her small apartment, staring at the phone she had just hung up. The voice on the other end had been professional, but urgent. Thomas was in trouble, and it had nothing to do with his safe assignment in San Diego. The consultation work with naval intelligence had been going smoothly until now. Margaret had answered questions about Morrison's old organization, provided insights into how the networks operated, and even helped identify patterns in current intelligence that matched methods she remembered from 20 years ago. The work felt clean and purposeful, nothing like the morally ambiguous activities of her past. Thomas had been thriving in his new assignment. During their weekly phone calls, he talked enthusiastically about the training programs he was helping develop. He seemed completely unaware that his assignment had been anything other than a fortunate placement for a promising young officer. Margaret had begun to believe that maybe this situation would resolve itself without complications. Then, everything changed. According to the intelligence analyst who had just called, one of Morrison's former associates named Viktor Petrov had surfaced in connection with a major arms trafficking operation. Petrov had been Morrison's second-in-command back in the early 2000s, and he apparently remembered Margaret very well. More importantly, he had somehow learned that she had testified against Morrison and his organization. He's put out word that he's looking for Margaret Williams, the analyst had explained. Our sources indicate he believes you have information about financial accounts that were never recovered after Morrison's arrest. He thinks you might know where substantial amounts of money are hidden. Margaret had tried to explain that she knew nothing about any hidden accounts, but the analyst's response had chilled her to the bone. It doesn't matter what you actually know, Mrs. Williams. It matters what Petrov thinks you know. And, according to our intelligence, he's willing to use any leverage necessary to get information from you. What kind of leverage? Margaret had asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. He knows about your son. He knows Thomas is a Navy officer. Petrov has connections with criminal organizations that operate near naval facilities, including San Diego. Now Margaret paced her small kitchen, trying to process what she had learned. Despite all of Admiral Richardson's assurances, Despite the carefully arranged safe assignment, her son was still in danger because of her past. The protective measures that had been put in place were no match for a determined enemy with his own network of resources. The phone rang again. This time it was Admiral Richardson himself. "Mrs. Williams, I assume you've been briefed on the Petrov situation," he said without preamble. "Yes," Margaret said. "I thought my son was supposed to be safe. I thought his assignment would keep him away from all of this." "Under normal circumstances, it would have," Admiral Richardson replied. "But Petrov's organization has capabilities we didn't fully anticipate. They've been tracking your son's location and routine. We believe they're planning to approach him soon." "Approach him how?" Margaret asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Most likely through seemingly innocent channels. They'll make contact in ways that don't raise immediate suspicions, perhaps through social events, romantic relationships, or professional connections. Once they establish a relationship with your son, they'll use that relationship to pressure you." Margaret felt sick. "What are my options?" "We're prepared to place your son in protective custody, but that would require telling him the truth about your past and the current threat. Alternatively, we can try to neutralize the threat before Petrov's people reach him." "How would you neutralize the threat?" Admiral Richardson paused. "We would need you to make direct contact with Petrov, convince him that you don't have the information he's looking for, and negotiate some kind of arrangement that leaves your son out of the equation." "You want me to meet with him?" Margaret's voice rose in panic. "After everything I've done to stay away from that world." "Mrs. Williams, I know this isn't what we discussed when you agreed to consult for us. But circumstances have changed. Petrov won't stop looking for you, and he won't hesitate to use your son as leverage. The only way to resolve this permanently is to deal with it directly." Margaret thought about Thomas, going about his daily routine in San Diego, completely unaware that dangerous people were watching him and planning to use him against his mother. She thought about all the years she had spent building a quiet, safe life, and how quickly it was all falling apart. "Where is Petrov now?" she asked. "He's in Los Angeles, operating through a front company that imports electronics. Our surveillance indicates he's planning to send operatives to San Diego within the next few days. We need to intercept him before that happens." "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "We want you to arrange a meeting with Petrov. You'll wear surveillance equipment so we can monitor the conversation and intervene if necessary. The goal is to convince him that you have no access to any hidden accounts and that pursuing you or your son would be pointless." Margaret realized she was facing the same impossible choice she had confronted 22 years ago. Back then, she had gotten involved with Morrison's organization to provide for her son. Now, she was being asked to confront Morrison's legacy for the same reason. "What if he doesn't believe me?" Margaret asked. "Then, we'll have to consider other options," Admiral Richardson said grimly. "But, Mrs. Williams, I want you to understand something. Whether you agree to meet with Petrov or not, he's going to continue pursuing this. He believes you have something he wants, and he's not going to give up easily. At least this way, you have some control over how the confrontation happens." Margaret walked to her bedroom and looked at herself in the mirror. The woman staring back at her looked older and more tired than she remembered. The simple waitress who had raised her son alone seemed like a character from someone else's story. She pulled off her shirt and looked at the tattoo on her shoulder, the anchor and the dates that had started this whole chain of events. She had gotten the tattoo as a reminder of her promise to stay away from the world that had nearly consumed her. Now that world was demanding that she break her promise one more time. "If I do this," Margaret said into the phone, "I want ironclad guarantees about my son's protection. Not just during the meeting, but permanently. I want Petrov to understand that pursuing my family will bring down more trouble than it's worth." "We can arrange that," Admiral Richardson said. "Petrov may be dangerous, but he's also a businessman. If we can convince him that the cost of pursuing you outweighs any potential benefit, he'll move on to easier targets." "And what about after this is over? What guarantee do I have that someone else from Morrison's old network won't surface in another few years?" "Honestly, none," Admiral Richardson admitted. "But, Mrs. Williams, this is your chance to close this chapter permanently. If you can convince Petrov that you're not worth pursuing, word will get out to others who might be interested. The criminal world operates on reputation and information. If Petrov concludes that you're a dead end, others will likely reach the same conclusion." Margaret thought about Thomas's voice during their last phone call. He had been excited about a project he was working on, something about improving simulator training for naval aviators. He sounded happy and fulfilled, completely focused on building his career and serving his country. The idea that his life was about to be shattered by his mother's past was unbearable. "I'll do it," Margaret said finally. "But I want to talk to Thomas first. I want to hear his voice and know he's okay before I walk into whatever trap you're setting up. Mrs. Williams, I need to advise you not to contact your son right now. Any unusual communication patterns might alert Petrov's surveillance to the fact that something is happening. Then, you call him," Margaret said firmly. "Use official Navy channels to check on his status. I want confirmation that he's safe before I agree to put myself at risk." "I can arrange that," Admiral Richardson agreed. "Mrs. Williams, I want you to know that we're going to do everything possible to ensure this meeting goes smoothly. Petrov will be under surveillance from the moment he enters the city. We'll have backup teams positioned nearby, and you'll be equipped with both audio and video monitoring." "What about afterward?" Margaret asked. "Assuming this works and Petrov agrees to leave us alone, what happens to my consultation arrangement with naval intelligence?" "That ends," Admiral Richardson said immediately. "You've provided valuable assistance, but once this situation is resolved, you can go back to your normal life. No more phone calls, no more questions about Morrison's organization. You'll have fulfilled any obligation you might have had to help with these investigations." Margaret felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The thought of being completely free from this world was appealing, but she also knew that freedom would come at a price. She would have to face Petrov, a man who represented everything she had tried to escape, and convince him to abandon a pursuit that he had apparently been planning for years. "When would this meeting happen?" Margaret asked. "Tomorrow night," Admiral Richardson said. "Petrov has agreed to meet at a restaurant in downtown Los Angeles. Neutral ground, public location, plenty of opportunities for surveillance and intervention if necessary." "He's already agreed to meet? How did you arrange that?" "We put out word through intermediaries that you were willing to discuss the location of certain financial information. Petrov responded immediately, which confirms that he believes you have access to something valuable." Margaret realized that the government had been planning this confrontation whether she agreed to it or not. They had simply given her the illusion of choice while maneuvering everyone into position for the meeting they wanted. "You were going to do this anyway, weren't you?" Margaret asked. "Whether I agreed or not, you were going to use me as bait to draw Petrov out." Admiral Richardson didn't deny it. "Mrs. Williams, Viktor Petrov represents a significant threat to national security. His organization has been responsible for weapons trafficking that has cost American lives. If we can neutralize that threat by resolving this situation with you, it serves everyone's interests." Margaret understood. She was not just a consultant helping with an investigation. She was an asset being deployed in an active operation. The promises about her son's safety were real, but they were also secondary to the larger mission of stopping Petrov's criminal enterprise. "I'll need to take time off work," Margaret said, accepting the reality of her situation. "That's already been arranged. Your supervisor at the diner has been told you have a family emergency and will be away for several days." As Margaret hung up the phone, she realized that her life had been carefully orchestrated by people she had never met, in service of goals she only partially understood. But none of that mattered as much as protecting Thomas. If facing Petrov was what it took to ensure her son's safety, then that's what she would do. She looked at her tattoo one more time, thinking about the promise it represented. Tomorrow, she would break that promise for the last time. But she would break it to protect the person who mattered most to her in the world. Sometimes, Margaret thought, keeping faith with the people we love requires us to betray faith with ourselves. The next evening, Margaret sat in a restaurant in downtown Los Angeles, waiting to confront the ghosts of her past. Across the city, Thomas was probably finishing his workday at the San Diego training facility, still unaware that his mother was about to risk everything to keep him safe. As Margaret waited for Petrov to arrive, she touched the hidden microphone under her clothes and whispered a silent prayer that this would finally end the nightmare that had begun with a desperate choice 22 years ago.